Welcome back to the Green Lectionary Podcast, a production of Creation Justice Ministries. The Green Lectionary is a conversation on Scripture through the lens of creation justice. My name is Derek Weston, Director of Theological Education and Formation, and today we will be looking at the text for the second Sunday of Lent. My guests today are Rev'd Grace Pritchard Burson, a priest in the Anglican Church of Canada serving the parish of All Saints by the Lake in Dorval, Quebec, and Reverend Daniel Wolpert, a spiritual director and Presbyterian pastor and the author of several books and multiple articles on spiritual life, leadership, and healing. Before we begin our episode, I want to share the launch of this year's annual resource. Every year, Creation Justice Ministries produces a resource on a particular issue, encouraging congregations to find ways to engage it. This year's resource is The Power of God, From Extractive Theology to Transforming Faith. In it, we discuss theological notions of power, just transitions to renewable energy, and stories of churches using their collective power for the sake of community. The resource also includes elements for worship, including 7 original songs. You can download the resource at www.creationjustice.org/powerofgod. Join us now as we look at Genesis 15 through the lens of creation justice. Our passage for today comes from Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 to 12, and verses 17 to 18. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me, for I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no offspring, so a slave born in my house is to be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir. He brought him outside and said, Look toward the heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them. Then he said to him, So shall your descendants be. And he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. Then he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you from the Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. He brought him all these and cut them in two, laying each half over against the other, but he did not cut the birds in two. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. So, where is creation in this passage?
Yeah, I actually was surprised by how many places it was, sort of how many big things it connected to. Having initially suggested that we use this passage rather than any of the others in the lectionary for the week, basically just because I tend to gravitate toward weird stuff. The whole concept of like land and how humanity relates to it. The question of children, which, both human population as an environmental concern and also more recently, people really being reluctant to bring children into the world in its current condition. And then also, of course, what initially caught my attention was the sort of proto-sacrifice. And one thing that I have been, since I first started connecting, scripture and environmental and sustainability concerns 20 plus years ago has been, the fact that you can't get away from killing, from slaughtering, both, humans of animals and animals of each other, if you're going to cope with ecosystems and food and all those other ways that we interact with the natural systems that sustain us. So yeah, several very large
Right.
fields of inquiry.
It's all over. All over. Yeah, the thing that I was thinking about when I read this passage was how, when we read these texts, we are really confronted by the fact that we are really dealing with a very, very different world, right? And
Mhm.
a very different culture. And, I feel like a lot of times we sort of treat the Bible as if, Jesus is some white guy from the suburbs. And, everything in the Bible is kind of the same as our society, just maybe a little different, but of course, that's really not true at all. And, here you have what is essentially a very indigenous, almost what we would call kind of shamanistic ritual.
Mhm.
And it's you've got dreams, you've got stars, you've got animals, you've got passing out and having visions. I mean, this is a very, very different reality, and it's deeply embedded in the natural world. I
Mhm.
mean, everything is being mediated by some kind of relationship to the natural world, and so it's and in that sense, right? I mean, this isn't happening in a church building. This isn't like the lectionary reading for today is cutting up three animals and staring at the stars, and he's outside somewhere. This is very non-religious in the modern sense.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's when you chose this passage, I was thinking, wow, there's actually so many places
Mhm.
that creation shows up here. Um, there, and I'm glad that we included in this conversation um, the thinking about the land.
Mhm.
One that part of this is Abram being told that he and his descendants are going to get a piece of land.
Mhm.
A piece of land is going to be theirs. It's going to be theirs, particularly, for generations.
Mhm.
Um, there's going to be this piece of land that is not theirs, by the way, that they are going to possess. And thinking
Mhm.
about that in terms of that, like, um, even that idea of possessing land and thinking
Mhm.
about the ways that we understand ideas of land possession, that was a big part of this.
Mhm.
Mhm.
um, there's the animals who are a part of the sacrifice, and then there's this weird, because I assume that um, in the ancient world where writing was much more complicated, that no words and no parts of the words are wasted, that birds of prey come in
Mhm.
and like try to kind of interrupt the sacrifice. And kind of like, and like I just kind of imagine Abram shooing vultures away.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a part of this as well.
Mhm.
Um, as well as the stars and the
Yeah.
and the and the all of these sorts of things. And Daniel, I love what you're really drawing us our attention to, because this is so foreign to us.
Mhm.
This is so,
Mhm.
and not only is it foreign, but in a lot of Christian contexts, we would call it pagan
Mhm.
or
Oh, absolutely.
primitive,
Yeah.
or like
Yeah.
this is we kind of let Abram get a pass because eventually this is going to turn out okay. We're going to get to something civilized down the road, but
Yeah. Yeah.
this is
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
primal
Yeah.
and visceral. Um,
Well, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, if a number of my, for example, native friends in northern Minnesota read this, I mean, it
Mhm.
would be very recognizable to them
Mhm.
as ceremony, right? I mean,
mm,
that's what they would call it.
Right.
And absolutely, I mean, this was the sort of thing that when white Europeans came to the Western Hemisphere and all kinds of other places, they saw people doing these kinds of things, and they said, oh, this is uncivilized and satanic. And as you said, Abram gets a pass because we kind of know how the story comes out, right? But I mean, these are representative of the basic ceremonial tools that people deployed for literally tens of thousands of years as a way of relating to the
Yeah.
non-material world.
And this may be a tangent, but like maybe not. Um, I would like to go back in time and smack my Western European ancestors, because like this type of thing was still present in their tradition.
Sure.
Like there's all kinds of weird stuff that people still do in the British Isles and elsewhere that like isn't as clear cut and dramatic as some of what's described here, or probably Daniel, what your friends do in northern Minnesota. But like it's there, there's like staying up all night and setting things on fire and entering altered mental states and rolling cheeses down hills, for God's sake. And like if we had just had the humility to like meet and on this continent and like do our dances together instead of like us insisting on taking over and imposing like early capitalism and all the associated shit, like things would be way less catastrophic now. So I did my senior presentation at the Institute of Sacred Music at Yale on the history of the English ritual year. So this is one of my hobby horses. Literally hobby horses, like hobby horses are a factor.
That's what you get on to chase the cheese after you've rolled it down the hill.
That's how you get pushed off a pier in Padstow, Cornwall, and they get soaking wet.
But I think that's such an important observation, that we've, not only have we we our ancestors in the faith made certain things, our ancestors in this country made certain things feel weird, that were alien to their culture, but also some things that were native to their culture. But in it for a purpose of sanitizing, right? That like part of what we were moving away from was our own creatureliness. We were we were sanitizing ourselves and moving away from our own connections to the natural world and the ways in which, as you said, Grace, that like we can't escape, as much as we might try, and as much as we might want to do it as ethically as possible, we can't really move away from killing. We can't move away from the losses of life, and that's a part of an animalistic cycle.
Yeah.
And we want to sanitize all of that.
Yeah, I mean, we try to go like, I don't personally, because it's totally not my thing, but people try to go vegan, and then more and more we're realizing that like plants can perceive and communicate. Like, is it really significantly more ethical to pull up a carrot than to slaughter a chicken? But you got to eat something. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and then of course the land piece that both of you have mentioned, and we may get into this later in our other sets of questions, but what's going on right now in Gaza is directly tied to this and a number of other passages in Genesis, right? And so this issue of right, which tribes get the land and who is sanctioning that, and how are we interpreting that, et cetera, is a very, very big part of this, because and this is the other thing when you talk about where is creation in this. So there are all these other people who get named at the end, And clearly, one of the problems is that, different sets of peoples don't get along.
Yeah.
And so, who gets to control certain geographical areas then becomes a tremendous focus of human society.
Yep.
Well, and one of the, we often talk about the idiosyncrasies of the lectionary. One of the idiosyncrasies of this particular lectionary
Yes.
passage is that it cuts off right before it names all those other people.
Right. In the
Right
middle of a
before
sentence.
it names all the folks who are going to be displaced
Yes.
by this, the fulfilling of Abram's dream. It just kind of like conveniently leaves out that there's at least, a half dozen tribes of people
Well,
that are going to be
yeah.
wiped out or displaced.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and it also leaves out the middle part of his vision, which talks about the Exodus. So, I mean, that's a whole other, the lectionary is so funny.
Reminder here to the lectionary preachers who may be listening to this that you're always allowed to add verses.
Yeah.
Right. The other verses are okay to
They're
add.
okay. And in fact, really kind of helps sometimes for context.
So I imagine the last couple of verses, they're just like, can the lector actually pronounce the Perizzites and the Girgashites?
Sure, there's that. There's that. But there's I have found in most churches there's a lot of grace for mispronunciation.
Oh yeah.
So
Oh, well, nobody knows. See, that's what I just tell people. Just read with confidence. Right? Like, because nobody else has any idea how to say it either. So you just, whatever you say it with confidence and it's fine.
There you go. There you go. So I want to move on to our next question. And I want to ask it this way. How do we see humanity interacting with non-human creation for good or for harm in this passage?
Well, I mean, it's not precisely non-human in its focus, but like this is all intersectional, right? That what we've just been talking about with the possession of the land is sort of clearly I think the verse that's going to in February of 2025 make our hackles rise the most immediately. Just the question of who gets to claim the territory. Like, is it even a good idea to be claiming territory at all? How do we reckon with the fact that our sacred texts really push this narrative in a way that, 2,500 years ago may have been on the side of the marginalized, but sure as heck doesn't seem to be now.
Right. Yeah. So again, if human beings break up into these tribes, which then consolidate into different size organizations, right? I mean, you don't have nation states for a long time, and then of course each group, it's the Bob Dylan song, God on their side, right? I mean, so each group then has a set of gods who are on their side, and you've got this non-material intelligence backing you up, and so every group tells a similar kind of story. God's on our side, we get this place, we screw up, we get kicked off this place. I mean, there really is this constant kind of rotation, because the human beings, again, in terms of interacting with creation, we have to interact with land in order to eat. Right? You don't have land, you don't eat. And so being able to have land where you can either stay and grow stuff, or it's big enough where you can be semi-nomadic or nomadic and hunt and eat stuff, you have to be able to do that. And then of course reproduction, that's the other thing, is that in an era where infant maternal mortality was at least 50%, you have to be able to have children to then continue to have a tribe. And so
Yep.
all of these things are deeply interactive, and some of it is positive in the sense that, you're trying to continue and function. But then when it's about killing the other people so you get someplace, well, that doesn't tend to work so well.
And a posture of territoriality and ownership and conflict with regards to outsiders doesn't tend to foster a sustainable land ethic internally. I mean,
Mhm.
it's a little bit beyond the scope of this passage, but when you get to Deuteronomy, to the land ethic, the point of caring for your fields and your pastures is to feed not just yourself but the alien and the one who must glean in order to make a living. Whereas if you're focused on this is my land and everybody else who crosses my arbitrarily drawn property line gets shot, you're probably not paying a whole lot of attention to the balance of the ecology, even within that property line. I mean, that's a gross generalization, but it also, I think, holds true to at least a considerable extent.
Yeah.
Well, and then the other big piece in this, again, getting back to the ritual aspect of this, the ceremony aspect, has to do with how do people know things,
Mm.
right? So where does knowledge arise? And this gets back to how did Western Christianity come to see these kinds of things as bad and demonic, right? So you have this entire movement uh, after the Reformation, mostly, that disses natural theology, right? You can't know anything from nature. And of course, like, well, did you read the Bible? Here, here it is, Abram knowing all kinds of stuff from nature, but um, because we have to know things from the books and the theology that are produced by the ecclesial establishment in the universities. And now you have to go to seminary in order to know things and learn things. And if you can just go out and learn from nature, well, that undermines the power of that entire structure, right?
Right.
But all of this ceremony is really about the fact that we can go into these different states of consciousness, whether that be sleep or hallucinations or whatever induced by substances, etc. And we can have then direct access to knowledge and knowledge that comes from God. And so that's a very, very powerful thing, and a very, very much in line with the entire contemplative tradition, which essentially is a kind of naturalist theology in terms of ways of knowing. And in our country too, and I mean, a lot of friends of mine who are coming out of the African tradition are talking about this a lot now. How can we reclaim these kinds of indigenous ways of knowing that, again, Black folks were told all this stuff is satanic. You've got to be, your Black church has to look like the white church. And how do we reclaim some of those ways of knowing?
I mean, I wouldn't put the blame entirely on the reformers. I think a very similar dynamic was present like 1,000 years previously when Christianity was trying to make itself respectable within the terms of Greco-Roman philosophy. With the unmoved mover and all the Gnostic, approach to things, and all the body's bad and we need to get past that and become a disembodied spirit like the divine Jesus. And yeah, I mean, I think like every time I get into a conversation like this, it all comes back to our basic beliefs as Christians, that the incarnation was real.
Yeah.
And so we must reckon with the material.
Yeah. I the sacrifice piece of this is so fascinating because because I'm torn about it. I'm torn about on one hand, this feels like non-human non-human creation, animals, like being used to serve a purpose for humans to self-determine, right? And that feels like, just another case of dominion and all the kinds of bad theology that I professionally rail against. But I also have been thinking a little bit more about the role that animals played in these communities, particularly these communities before law and all those sorts of things. This wasn't just a sacrifice in terms of a ritual. This was sacrificing members of Abram's community that were of value to him, not just of monetary value to him, but of like these were things for whom he had cared, that he had raised, that were a part of this kind of like nomadic tribe that he was a part of, and to, in one fell swoop, get rid of 12 animals at one time, that's a big ask that God made. That would have cost Abram something. Again, not just kind of like in the consumeristic financial terms,
Right.
in
Yeah, I mean,
the relational terms of what it meant to be a part of that community.
Yeah. And Derek, I'm pretty sure your household, if you don't currently, you have had chickens in the past, right?
I have wanted chickens, and I have been envious of others who have chickens.
Oh, okay. I must be getting
So
confused with somebody
maybe
else.
what you've seen is my desire for chickens, which I've been very public about.
I have had chickens. I do not currently, since I live in Montreal right now, but I spent 4 years in a small town in New Hampshire. And I still have the hope that someday I will be back, in a place where I can have not just chickens, but possibly even bigger livestock, and the big garden and the compost heap. And I'm never going to be a nomad in the Near East, but there's a real sense in which sort of plugging yourself, well, I mean, Abram obviously never left. He was completely contained within them, but plugging yourself back into those cycles, it's just so, I mean, primal makes it sound sort of, I don't know, like a bunch of white people doing a drum circle, which is not what I want to convey, but like it's satisfying in this atavistic way to be with your own hands in, quote unquote, your own soil, fostering life.
Yes.
Like making that happen. Yeah. And some of it gets fed to the livestock, and some of it gets fed to you, and some of, like, the scraps from your table then get fed back to the chickens, and then they give you their eggs. And before I had this house where I had my own chickens, I was an intern on a biodynamic farm in northern Vermont, which was a trip and a half, and that's a whole other story. But that was where I slaughtered my first chicken, and I genuinely, like, I tell my fellow clergy, and particularly like seminarians, like, I really think that, all other things being equal, priests who are going to be ordained into a sacramental tradition should have to slaughter a chicken before they celebrate the Eucharist, because it's just part of that same cycle. And so, like, not just in terms of property and not just in terms of community, but also in terms of, like, being part of nature. Like, I can imagine Abram sort of getting up in the morning and looking at his flocks and just being happy about how they're thriving, that they have food, that they have water, that they are happy animal selves in sort of the best possible way that an animal can be itself, and that he is part of giving them that life, and protecting them from predation, and and yes, eventually he and his family are going to slaughter and eat them, and that's part of the whole process. And I'm not sure if I'm expressing this at all well, but
Yeah.
I look at the sacrificial system in like the temple period as it developed, and like in many ways, I think that was already kind of a perversion because it was on such a huge scale with such a consumption of animal flesh and firewood in particular, in a very marginal ecosystem. But there's something there sort of at the beginning that I think, humanity, by moving away from its pastoral, nomadic, agricultural, possibly even before that hunter-gatherer origins, like we have not reckoned with what it means to lose that.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess, my point of view on this is very much informed by running a farm for years and living in rural communities for years. I just think that this is so different from modern, particularly urban life. I think this is actually a lot more ordinary in some ways than we give it credit for. That, again, when you're out there living with not only your animals, but all the other animals, right, that are coming to eat your animals, right? Like, as you said, the birds are coming down to try to eat the barbecue. They're like, hey, there's barbecue, and, the deer are coming to eat your vegetables. The raccoons are coming to eat whatever they can find. The skunks are eating your eggs. The foxes are trying to eat the chickens. There's just like animals everywhere, like all eating stuff. Everybody's got to eat, right? And then also the fact that when you do slaughter animals, you get to really eat well, right? So again, I was thinking about a situation where, I went and visited some friends on one of the native reservations, and when we left, one of the guys said to me, "We'll come back again. We'll get to eat." And what he was talking about was the fact that when you have special occasions, you like break out your best food. Right, and so you do, you slaughter the unblemished calf, and you think about the great story of the son that comes back, right? And let's have a party, let's slaughter the best animals, and so I think that the cycles of life and death are just with you in a way that we are totally disconnected from. And so the idea of, as you said, like, go slaughter a chicken and it's, this big deal and everything. Again, if you've got chickens are always dying. You're always killing chickens. You're raising them, you're killing. I mean, there's a whole thing that happens with that once you start having them. And and so I think for these folks, in some ways, this story would also sound very ordinary in a lot of ways, very common. That to us, just indicates to me how removed from a lot of these cycles we are.
And just 3 chapters later, we get, like God or God's representative, it's never entirely clear, visiting Abram and Sarah and sort of ratifying this promise that they will have a child of their own. And what does Abram do? He goes and gets the fatted calf and cooks it up.
Yeah. And mixed in all of that is gratitude. Mixed in all of that is gratitude for the abundance that creation gives us. Mixed in all of that is gratitude for the communities that we have. It's so, this is such a weird and wonderful conversation, and I'm so glad you two picked this passage because you're the perfect people to talk about it. It's such a weird and wonderful conversation because it drives home this isn't Daniel, as you said, this isn't a Jesus of the suburbs. This is a wholly different world. with a whole that we are not only geographically far from, we are technologically far from, we are
Mhm.
ethically far from, we are spiritually far from. And to have these stories that are so central to our faith, anytime someone says, "Well, the Bible is clear on something," I'm like, "Woof, man, that's not true about anything."
Yeah.
So because this world is so foreign to our own. Um, so in light of all of these weird, wonderful things that we've talked about, where is there a call to action for the church from this passage?
Well, as I said, to me, one of the biggest things that I feel like the church, to my mind, needs to take a much clearer stand on, because of this whole issue of, the Bible is the word of God, it is that God is not condoning ethnic cleansing.
Mm,
Like, that's not okay. And even though it says in here that God says it's okay, like, that's actually not okay. Because I said, I mean, Netanyahu, the current prime minister of Israel, I mean, he quotes these kinds of passages and says, this is why we need to, and this whole idea, that's now being floated much more openly, but by no means was Trump's idea. This idea of just clearing out Gaza, I mean, this has been the Israeli right-wing plan from day one in terms of this war. And they quote these kinds of passages and say, God gave us the land, everybody else get out. So that's, to me, one of the main things that, and I feel like the church continues to sort of skirt around this because people are afraid if they get up and say, the Bible, this isn't really good, then it's like, oh, you're not biblical and blah, 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 blah. And people aren't even equipped to figure out how to talk about that. So to me, I feel like that's one of the biggest things that comes up when we read these passages. And I see so many pastors, various other church officials who are just, and I think it's kind of fear, right? You don't want to get fired. You don't want the grumpy conservative rich person to storm out of your church. I mean, whatever it may be, to just say, like, no, this is not how we're going to interpret this anymore, and this is not how we're going to talk about this. But that's a big thing. And as I said, we see that being played out right now on the world stage in a huge way.
Completely different, but going back to the end of the conversation about, in response to the previous question, for the church to be way less squeamish about all this stuff,
mm,
about bodies and nature and death, and and it's hard because, like, anytime you start talking about sacrifice, it's like, okay, what's being sacrificed, by whom, to what, for what purpose? And there are obviously ways in which you absolutely do not want to encourage the shedding of blood, but it's there, it's going to happen so that we can eat, and by we I mean like every organism on the planet. um and so we can't just pretend it doesn't exist. We do our best, and that's part of what's gotten us into this predicament, with living in hermetically sealed houses and sanitizing everything to within an inch of its life. Um,
Yeah.
and,
Well, and
so
sacrifice is a very important spiritual
mhm.
issue, right?
We do,
That
in
that
fact, believe in a God who died on a cross.
Well, yeah, and if we are going to live together on a finite planet,
Mhm.
right? And we need to say, oh, some people consuming infinitely is going to be a problem for lots of other people, right? So sacrifice, I mean, the spiritual vow of poverty, for example,
Mhm.
is not about being destitute, but it is essentially about sacrifice, about saying, I am not going to infinitely hoard material possessions. I'm not going to infinitely consume. I'm going to sacrifice that whole way of being in
Mhm.
order that everybody in the community can flourish, and including actually the land and
Mhm.
animals around the monastery and all kinds of other biological systems.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, sacrifice is an incredibly important thing, and I mean, certainly in a lot of American culture and in capitalist culture, it's almost sort of a dirty word.
Mhm.
um, and unless you're talking about athletic performance, interestingly, and then
Right.
it's okay, right? No pain, no gain.
Well, though, I mean, at the same time, while we're not saying we're doing it, we are continually demanding the sacrifices that the tribes dispossessed by Israel offered to Mammon and Moloch. Like those
Mhm.
sacrifices, we seem to be just fine with as long as we don't call it that.
Well,
But
and we refer to our places where we dump our waste
Mhm.
and get rid of our toxins in this country as sacrifice zones.
Mhm.
That like there are parts of this country that we are happy to sacrifice, mostly in communities of Black and Brown people,
Yep.
um, so that we don't see the runoff of our empire.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Um, it's a that's a like we use that term in our context in some pretty perverted ways.
Mhm.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And and then to me, the sort of big final area that I was thinking a lot about in terms of this passage and kind of modern usage, one way or another, is that right now we're having this incredible flourishing of psychedelic activity,
Hmm.
right? Psychedelic assisted therapies, psychedelic assisted, spiritual journeys, psychedelic assisted this, that, and the other thing, everything, right? And it is unbelievable how that is growing. I mean, it boggles my mind. As an old hippie, it's just like, oh my gosh, this is like the '60s on steroids, right? Because it's not just the young people. I mean, I had one woman in her 80s who came to me telling me about how she and the 86-year-old down the hallway from her had scavenged some psychedelic mushroom spores from the garden, and they were growing them, and she wanted recipes for microdosing. I mean, so I feel like there is this thing that is happening, and it very much is following on or relating to the rise in contemplative interest. There is this desire for the kind of experience that leads to knowledge that is being offered here in this passage.
Mm.
And even though the church has rejected this largely, as we've talked about, people are saying, no, there is a way of having these altered states that provide us with a connection to wisdom. And so, that's a fascinating thing that is kind of happening spontaneously, very much largely outside of any religious system. But as we've said, this is not foreign to religious systems by any means. And so, I just find that as a fascinating, wouldn't be interesting. And I know there are some very fringe places in the church that are talking about this, but, wouldn't it be interesting if we embraced this conversation to a far greater degree?
I think about the fact that one of the common um, criticisms of those who have left the church, particularly younger people who have left the church, is that there's nothing spiritual happening there.
Right.
And people are looking for spiritual experiences. And I think that's absolutely what this kind of uptick, I think especially now when we are so sanitized and connected to screens, I think people especially now are looking for spiritual experiences. And boy, isn't that a thing the church could learn something from?
Yes.
But I want to, just because this is just take a moment of privilege because it's my show. But I'm so glad that we did touch a little bit on the Gaza situation, because we haven't much on this show. One of the and particularly for people who do deeply care about creation justice, we have to understand what's happening there as a land issue, as something that is happening to creation, as something that empires do to land, something empires do to creation. And that includes the eradication of people groups. That includes, and even if we take their names out of the lectionary, those people groups matter. So it's important for us to, one of you used the, Grace, I think it was you, that we be incredibly intersectional and thinking about,
and intersectionality, of course, includes the natural world.
absolutely, absolutely. To recognize that it's not just about land, it's about land and the peoples and animals and waters that live in that land, that are on that land.
I mean, and I could go off on a whole other tangent about the feminist implications of all of this. But yeah, I mean, like on the very most basic level, like Gaza in 2025 is just dead. I mean, like it's land, but there's nothing alive there. You look at the pictures and it's just like how, I mean, with time, obviously, if the conflict could be brought to an end, it could be brought back to life. But right now, it's like the surface of the moon.
Yeah, and if you look at any number of other conflicts around the world that don't get nearly as much press, you see an absolutely same kind of dynamic, right? That you have these human tribal groups, essentially, whether they're nations or smaller groups of individuals, battling each other over land for one reason or another, and the result of that is an incredible environmental catastrophe, environmental in the broadest sense of the word, including the human environment. But there's always a total environmental catastrophe that goes along with that. And writ large on the planet, I would say that really the issue in climate change is the same kind of thing, right? That we are battling for territory, we're battling for land. I mean, again, why does the current administration want Greenland? Because most of our rare earth metals come from China. There are a lot of rare earth metals there. He's like, great, this is the place. I'm gonna mine Greenland. And it's like when the ice cap melts on Greenland, the ocean's going to rise 10 feet. I mean, how much more disconnected from reality can we be to think, oh, that sounds like a great idea. Yeah, that that sounds wonderful.
Yeah. Daniel, Grace, thank you both for taking us to some hard and weird but like really needed places in this conversation. This was really rich, and I'm really grateful
Thank
for
you for the
both of you
invitation.
and both of your voices. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's been really fun.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for the Green Lectionary Podcast. This episode was produced by Sprocket Wagner, and the music was provided by Christian McIver. Please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and help us spread the word with a good review. You can support this and other programs of Creation Justice Ministries at creationjustice.org/donate.
Our story comes alive within these pages, for every time and place throughout the ages. God speaks and is heard, and the enduring word calls us to care for our world as we share the love that can set creation free. Restoring the earth to wholeness, peace, and harmony. Let the songs of the water, land, and sky resound, 'cause together we're all bound. Within these pages, there's always new life to be found.